Well, to start, thanks to Danny for putting on this wonderful conference year after year. And thank you to all of the illustrious presenters for adding such valuable insight that we will absorb over the course of the weekend. For those of you who are unfamiliar with who we are, my name is Josh Andrus, and I am the Executive Director of Project Confederation, which is a subsidiary of the Alberta Institute, a federally registered nonprofit think tank. I founded Project Confederation in July 2019 as a response to rising feelings of Western alienation among citizens of Alberta. These feelings are not new to politics in Canada. In fact, they have been a consistent theme throughout the history of this country. And like so many others, I will begin with a brief journey through history, but not too far. I'm not going to take us through a long-winded soliloquy of federal-provincial tensions which date back to the purchase of Rupert's Land from the Hudson's Bay Company in 1868. I'll leave that to others. I'm just going to take us back a few years to the summer of 2014. It was an interesting summer. Alison Redford had resigned in disgrace, and a leadership race was in full swing for the Progressive Conservatives. At the time, the news was all bustling over license plate slogans, perceived infrastructure deficits, free memberships, and, of course, plane dossiers. But there was one story that stuck out to me at the time, and it was a spat over the temporary foreign workers program. Of course, we all remember the good old days, perhaps somewhat bracingly given the current state of affairs. Alberta's economy was booming on the back of record oil prices, which at the time were bouncing off $100. There were more jobs than there were people to work those jobs. And the temporary foreign worker program was seen as a vital tool to bring in trained workers to fill these openings. In mid-June, Canada's Minister of Immigration, Jason Kenney, announced that the federal government would be capping the number of low-wage workers in an employer's workforce at 10%. Of course, given the structure of Alberta's labor force, this was met by hostility from our provincial politicians. The reason I bring this particular story to mind is even that when times are good and people are working, that there are going to be areas in which having more provincial autonomy is a positive for Alberta. And there are those who may scoff at feelings of Western alienation. There are those who believe that an oil price spike back to the $80 to $100 range will fix everything. And there are those who will say that if you vote Conservative, you will be taken care of. A simple walk down memory lane to only 7 years ago shows that Alberta, in good times or bad, needs to have more autonomy over its provincial affairs. And yet here we are. Jason Kenney is now the premier of an embattled province in the depths of a now 6-year recession. I'm quite certain that he has spent many hours pondering his government's positioning vis-a-vis the Fair Deal front that was announced 16 months ago. He's already received stern advice from academics and policy thinkers, many of whom are in this room, business leaders, public sector unions, and of course, those dreaded opposition politicians. In the midst of all of these opinionated thought leaders, I don't want to presume upon you all, but I consider it prudent to add my own voice. Over recent months, I have become increasingly concerned about the slow pace of movement on the Fair Deal front. I have to admit that at times it is difficult to recognize that this government's front of mind issue is a COVID-19 pandemic that has dominated both front page headlines and imaginary water cooler conversations across the globe. However, the pandemic has only highlighted many of the reasons why greater autonomy is not a luxury that we can afford to shy away from. There are those on the other side, mainly populated by government sector union leaders, voicing what we can only imagine are the concerns of their well-paid and pensioned members. We have seen over the past year, as pointed out by Franco Terrazzano at the Canadian Taxpayers Federation, our public sector expand while our private industries have been decimated. Hundreds of thousands, if not millions of Albertans are either underemployed or unemployed and increasingly dependent not on their own hands for income, but on handouts from the government. The people involved in these public sector unions are not particularly worried about our relationship with Ottawa and seem to be more intent on protecting their own interests at the expense of the taxpayers that pay them. We cannot become a province dominated by government employees. Jason Kenney had campaigned to create a free enterprise province, but alas, I have become increasingly concerned with the direction that his government has taken. That being said, and I may be concerned with provincial government actions, I am nothing short of alarmed regarding the behavior of the federal government. We have seen no concrete action regarding the Biden administration's disastrous decision to cancel the Keystone XL pipeline, killing thousands of jobs on both sides of the border. I am aware of the legal efforts that the provincial government has made regarding fighting this grave economic decision. However, without the support of Ottawa, these efforts are unlikely to succeed. There is absolutely no assurance that similar instances will not mar federal-provincial relations in the months and years ahead. I would even argue the reverse, that they are inevitable. This doesn't necessarily have to be the case. As the Premier and head of government, Kenney has many tools at his disposal in order to create a firewall around this province and to help prevent the federal government from crushing our already beleaguered economy. I've seen much chatter in recent months opposed to the fair deal efforts the provincial government has, to their credit, at least begun to undertake. Since then, however, we have seen even more animosity from our Eastern allies than we did before. Even in our darkest hours, while we struggled to deal with a surge in COVID-19 cases in the winter, we were ridiculed by Eastern academics and politicians. The most egregious of insults was hurled our way by University of Ottawa professor Amir Ataran, who suggested that the federal government not help Alberta in the fight against COVID-19 and called our struggles cocky failure. Was he met by derision from the federal government? No. Crickets. This provincial government must guarantee to themselves and to us, their citizens, that they will do everything they can to protect us from an ignorant and hostile government in Ottawa. In no other way can this province begin to regain hope and begin to rebuild. We need firewalls around us to help cushion the blow of the federal government dedicated to destroying our livelihoods. And I'm sorry that this is the way it must go. I was born Canadian, loud and proud. I wore that maple leaf on my sleeve while I watched our countrymen compete in international affairs, from business to politics to athletics to academics. However, the fragmented state of our current relationship with Ottawa has become nothing short of disastrous. For decades, we have been cheated and essentially treated as a colony of the East, forced unwillingly to send billions upon billions of dollars to the rest of the country in the form of equalization. And we don't have the political representation in Ottawa to stop these unfair transfers, as only 34 of the 338 MPs in the House of Commons represent the province of Alberta. It is vital to the future of the province that these abuses stop. We are a province struggling in the face of the worst recession since the Great Depression, and yet Ottawa still sees it prudent to continue to stomp on us. There are two and only two ways to fix this. Anything less would be a profound disappointment, not just to me, but to thousands of people in this province who are being hurt by the unfair treatment of the federal government. First, the government of Alberta must hold a referendum to abolish equalization from the Canadian Constitution. The proposed wording, as laid out by the Fair Deal panel, is as follows. Do you support the removal of Section 36, which deals with the principle of equalization from the Constitution Act of 1982? According to the Quebec secession reference of the Supreme Court of Canada in 1998, any constitutional resolution passed by any provincial legislature triggers a duty for the federal government to negotiate with the provincial government that holds it, as long as that question is clear. According to the Constitutional Referendum Act and a provincial law, all constitutional resolutions must first be put in front of the citizens in a referendum form. The clarity of the question is vital. Asking to reform or renegotiate equalization are not clear enough questions to trigger the clause, especially when the concept of equalization, but not the formula, is ingrained in the Constitution itself. Second, Mr. Kenney must call on his contemporary premiers to have a constitutional convention in order to work through these issues that we have. On the question of representation, Kenney was first elected as a member of the Reform Party, which fought extensively on the concept of a Triple E Senate. For those of you who are unfamiliar or have forgotten, this means that constitutional changes are required to create an elected Senate with an equal number of senators per province and one that has effective powers. This would effectively create a second arm of government, one that can act as a check on the House of Commons, where 199 of the 338 seats in Parliament are in Quebec and Ontario alone. The Triple E Senate is not a dead letter, or three, simply due to the Supreme Court's ruling that reforms cannot be dictated to them by the federal government. That ruling left the door open for the provinces, through coalition building and hard work, to come to that agreement. It is vital that the government of this province understand that. However, in order for either of these objectives to succeed, the government of Alberta must be taken seriously, which is why the success of my first two recommendations are dependent on the establishment of the Firewall initiatives as laid out in the Alberta Agenda 20 years ago, and I bet Tom's going to talk about this a lot later. A provincial pension plan is a statement piece that will get attention across the country. As a young working class population, Albertans contribute much more into the Canadian pension plan than we receive in payments. Establishing a provincial pension plan would see premiums drop substantially for our citizens while giving us the ability to maintain benefits as is. Most of the opposition I have seen comes from public sector unions who take the approach, keep your hands off my pension, don't touch my pension. However, the Alberta pension plan, like the Canadian pension plan, must be overseen by a body independent of government decision makers. While I have personally become quite alarmed at the immense exposure to China that the Canadian Pension Plan Investment Board has undertaken in recent years, it would be unfair for me to criticize the board as an arm of the federal government. Investment decisions in both cases must unequivocally be independent of the government. A provincial police force is another necessity. It's not a direct financial benefit to Albertans, and there have been some steps in recent months to improve the rural crime problem that has dominated headlines for years. However, the point of the exercise is to build firewalls around Alberta, and having a police force that is provincially run, trained, and operated will allow for policy flexibility that is currently unavailable in a federal force that works from coast to coast. There will be costs, but the current estimates put forth by the RCMP union severely overstates most of the needs, especially when the existing infrastructure would not need to be built from scratch. Now, I'm not arguing that one person or group of people can develop the ideal police force or pension plan, whether that be on a federal or a provincial level. The difference in each case is that the objectives of each organization would be immensely benefited by the localized nature of the organizational design. Decisions would be taken with the citizens of a smaller subsection of people in mind, leading to more focus on a macro level or a micro level rather than a macro one. These fundamental principles are what drives the goal of more autonomy for Alberta, and localized decision making will be an important piece of this province if or when we see economic good times return. It would be argued by some that the Firewall Objectives are steps in the path of independence, and those arguments are 100% correct. There are objectives within the Alberta agenda, such as tax collecting, that Danielle is going to speak about tomorrow, or opting out of federal transfers, that were deemed unnecessary by the Fair Deal panel report. However, like Justin Trudeau's inability to be taken seriously as he defends the interests of our energy sector, it is vital to the Fair Deal stance that Alberta make it clear to Ottawa that we are not to be taken lightly. Failing to enact enough legislation to build enough institutional support for autonomy will inevitably weaken our hand as we head to Ottawa seeking fairness. Failing to enact any of them makes our entire position untenable and unserious. The economic accolades of a province in recent years are fond memories. What is important today is to build cornerstone institutions that will be set up to thrive once we can position our economy in the right way, in whatever form that may take. We owe our past success to the hard work of our blue-collar population who have watched, breathless, a once thriving economy become a global laughingstock. There are many variations of a fair deal that can possibly be achieved, but all tools at our disposal must be in play as soon as possible. Time is of the essence, and as our situation further deteriorates, urgency is required to alleviate the pressure. I can tell by the Premier's demeanor of late that he is getting frustrated with the lack of support he has from those who sent him to Edmonton in 2019. It's important to note that the problems that have existed since 1868 are still ever present in our political conversations today, and that by working to fix these problems, Kenny will undoubtedly find that Albertans will have his back, and that he will not be taken lightly. After all, isn't one of the greatest lessons of politics that through firm belief, dogged determination, an imposing presence and pervasive oratory arguments that anything is possible? I hope that Mr. Kenney will remember that it was local considerations that influenced past Alberta political icons such as Ernest Manning, Peter Lougheed, and Ralph Klein. When he does, I hope that he does not forget that to do justice for all Albertans is to work on our future for our ends, legislate for our prosperity, and do not bend at the knee to a country that views us as a way to fund their lavish lifestyles. I hope that he will not be influenced by the contemplation of an overwhelming and overshadowing country. We must be ambitious in our aspirations and not apprehensive in our ambitions. It's time that we stand up for ourselves and stop being constantly reminded that we are all subjects of an overreaching government dedicated to crushing our economy and our livelihoods. We can't do this alone. Please join our campaign for a fair deal by visiting our website at projectconfederation.ca. Thank you.